words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. There was a long story about anger on NPR on Monday morning, and I sort of listened to it with half an ear as I was getting ready for work. I think of myself as being pretty even-keeled. I don't really feel like I have a problem with anger, so I wasn't all that interested in what the story was about. A couple days later, I was on my way here to church, and an ambulance passed by on the other side of the road, and I pulled over as you're supposed to. And as it passed, I was getting ready to pull back out, and this idiot cut me off. And I found myself reflexively beginning to make a rude gesture. And then I realized I was wearing a clergy shirt and collar, and that's probably not the best advertisement for Christianity. So I went back and listened to that story about anger, and it's really pretty interesting. The psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett suggests that as a means of dealing with your anger, anger and processing it well, that you develop what she calls emotional granularity. That is, look at the different types of anger that you have. There's the anger that you have when somebody cuts you off in traffic. There's the anger that you have maybe with yourself because you did something stupid or wrong. There's the anger you have with your spouse or your children because they disappointed you. There's the anger you have with your boss because you're feeling underappreciated. She suggests that developing this emotional granularity helps you to deal with different types of anger in the most appropriate and effective ways. She says other cultures have some really kind of interesting names for different types of anger. I found a couple of them kind of amusing. There's a German word for a certain type of anger that translates roughly a face begging to be slapped. It's backpfeifenmusik. And it's that anger when you're so mad at somebody that you just feel like you're going to smack them across the face. There's a phrase in India that is about the kind of anger that just comes up on you all of a sudden, and it roughly translates like eggplant hitting hot oil, that kind of sizzle that you feel all of a sudden you start kind of spitting and hissing. As it turned out, this was kind of a good story for me to listen to this week because there's a lot of anger in this story that we just heard from Luke's Gospel. And I have to say, I think on balance, it's probably Jesus' fault. You know, this is kind of part 2 of last week's story from Luke's Gospel. You remember that last week Jesus has been preaching and teaching around Galilee, and he decides it's time to go home to Nazareth and preach in his home synagogue where he grew up. Everyone in town is there. They can't wait to hear how Joseph and Mary's boy has made good for himself. Jesus unrolls the scroll of Isaiah, and he reads from chapter 61. The Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, sight to the blind, freedom to the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He rolls up the scroll and hands it back to the attendant, and he sits down and he says, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." He probably should have left it there. But he goes on, and it's hard for us to understand what so enrages the folks in the synagogue, because it's so rooted in what it meant to be Jewish 2,000 years ago. Israel believed itself to be the nation among nations, God's chosen nation. They were a light, they understood themselves to be a light to the other nations. They were favored. So being Jewish, being a member of the nation of Israel, was viewed as a high honor, as a high privilege. And anyone who was not Jewish and not a member of the nation of Israel was viewed as lesser. Jesus goes on to tell 2 stories about the 2 great prophets of Jewish history, Elijah and Elisha. He says that in the time of the famine during Elijah's day, Elijah was not sent to any of the dozens of widows who were suffering, who were hungry in Israel. Rather, Elijah was sent to the widow at Zarephath in Sidon, not a Jewish widow, not a member of the nation of Israel, but Elijah was sent to go help her. Then he goes on and says, in the time of Elisha, the prophet, there were many people in Israel suffering from leprosy, but Elisha wasn't sent to heal any of them. Elisha was sent to heal Naaman the Syrian. Now, Syria is a neighbor of Israel, but they were an enemy of Israel. Naaman was a general with his own army. He was constantly attacking towns and cities in Israel and causing all sorts of havoc. And the idea that God sent Elisha to go cure Naaman, this enemy of Israel, and not to cure the people of the nation of Israel, infuriates the folks in the synagogue. It angers them so much that they try and throw Jesus off a cliff. We may still not quite get it, but it's like Jesus says to the people in the synagogue, look, I don't come just to proclaim good news to the deserving poor, the people who are poor not of their own fault, but who have just fallen on hard times. I come to proclaim good news to all the poor. I don't just come to proclaim freedom to the captives who have been unjustly accused. I come to proclaim freedom to all captives. I don't just come to proclaim sight to the blind who are blind through no fault of their own. I come to proclaim sight to even people who are blind of their own doing, who intentionally have blinkers on so they can't see the world. I don't just come to proclaim freedom to the people who think that they're oppressed, if you're feeling oppressed. I come to proclaim freedom to the people that you are oppressing. Now maybe that sounds like good news to you. Maybe you feel like a bit of an outsider. It sounds like good news that Jesus comes to proclaim good news to the poor, good news, sight to the blind, release to the captives, freedom from the oppressed. Because who among us hasn't at some point or other in our lives been hungry, has felt blind, has felt oppressed, has felt captive to something? But if, for whatever reason, this passage, this idea bothers you, I encourage you to spend some time developing some emotional granularity around why. If the idea of Jesus coming to proclaim good news to people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who don't act like you, to people that you don't like, even to people that you hate, bothers you, spend some time praying and reflecting on why that is. Does the idea of proclaiming good news to the poor frighten you because you're afraid that you'll be called upon to share of what you have, and at the end of the day, there won't be enough for you and your family? Does the idea of proclaiming freedom for the captives offend your sense of fairness? After all, there are people who have done bad things, who deserve to be in prison. Does God's idea of justice offend your sense of fairness? Are you afraid that God comes to proclaim sight to the blind, and maybe you're one of those blind people, that you look through the world through your own lens, with your own tunnel vision, and that if God comes to proclaim sight to you, you'll be able to see the world through God's eyes, or be forced to see the world through God's eyes, and your whole conception of this life, your place in it, what you're called to do, will be upended. Are you worried that if God comes to proclaim freedom to the oppressed, that somehow there will be less freedom for you? Maybe this sounds like good news to you, and maybe it doesn't. And if it doesn't, spend some time reflecting on why, so that you can be part of proclaiming good news to the poor, release to the captives, sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed. That you can be part of proclaiming the year of God's favor. That you can be part of proclaiming good news. That you can be part of bringing about God's kingdom.